Hello everyone and welcome to what is the final in our little mini-series of Frontline Voices podcasts. I'm Liz Dawson, I'm your host for today. I'm the Director of Communications at South Tyneside and Sunderland Foundation Trust, but also have the pleasure of working for the Provider Collaborative and getting to meet all sorts of people from across the region. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Stu Holliday, who's the Head of Emergency Preparedness, Resilience and Response, right. I'll get that right, at the North East Ambulance Service, NEAS, which we'll probably refer to as we get into the show. And Stu's team really helps NEAS to prepare for everything that is coming its way, from winter pressures, unexpected events, major incidents and severe weather. So lots for us to talk about today. Welcome to the podcast, Stu.
Thank you for having me.
Can we start by you just sort of telling us a little bit about yourself, your job, your role, and what that involves?
Yes, certainly. So I've been with the North East Ambulance Service now just over 20 years. I had a brief interim period where I went to South Tyneside and Sunderland Foundation Trust and worked there for a little bit over COVID. Started my career as a paramedic and then have had various jobs in the trust since then, the latest of which is as head of APRR. So APRR is a function that is common across all health, really, and generally, as you've described, we're there to prepare for incidents, complex, major incidents, business continuity incidents, and certainly have plans in place for response and in mitigation. But also within the ambulance service, we also have an extra obligation, which are termed the interoperable capabilities. So that covers things like our hazardous area response team and mass casualty vehicle deployment and making sure we have good command and control structures in place. And then we have other duties that are aligned to events and making sure that that any events that happen in the region, music events, sporting events, have sufficient medical cover so as not to impact our acute trusts, and lots of other things that get wrapped in around
all these unseen things that the public probably don't recognise that we're having to prepare and be ready for should they happen.
Completely, and in winter and surge being one of them.
Yeah, we'll come on to have a bit of a discussion about winter. I hope we're nearing the end of winter now. But I guess before we get into that, is there a typical week in your job? Can you explain some of the things that you would, cover in a typical week?
Part of it is the joy of the job is that there's not a typical week. But certainly it's cyclical in terms of what we look at. So, leading up to winter, all of the focus tends to be on how we're preparing as a trust for winter. As we come out of winter, we tend to come into the summer season where there's lots of events happening. And then all year round, we do lots of training and testing and exercising with our multi-agency partners, with blue light partners and others. We are quite heavily involved with our local resilience forums, so do a lot of planning and preparation together with all of the Category 2 responders in the local resilience forum.
How's this winter been? How has it felt?
I think this winter has felt not too bad so far in that I think we probably 2 years ago now with the establishment of the System Coordination Centre and then within NEAS, our Operations Coordination Centre. We then had a structure and in a more formal way of being able to collaborate and meet and identify pressures earlier on and put plans in place. And I think over the past 2 years we've matured as a region with that model. So I think we're very good at being able to collaborate. So where in the past we would have had, and still do to some extent, issues in terms of hospital handover delays, as it being the one example. Sure. Yes, it's still an issue at times, but we're much better at identifying it early and putting solutions in place earlier as well. So as we've gone through this winter, we've seen an increase in demand across 999 and 111. But we've our response times, which is one of the things that we're measured on, we're actually doing very well. We're one of the best in the country, if not the best in the country, for a lot of the response times. And I think that's just a testimony to the planning and preparations that's gone on, and the system work that's gone on over the past several years.
And we were talking just before we started filming about some of the new initiatives that we've got in place, so that it isn't always about people coming to hospital. The work you do to try and get people to other points of the healthcare system. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I just reflect on when I started 20 years ago. Essentially everybody who you went out to on an ambulance went into hospital because there was nothing else, and we weren't particularly trained to identify alternatives. Now it's completely different. Now when paramedics go out on the ambulances to somebody, their first thought is not, I need to take this person to hospital. It's now about exploring alternative pathways, which includes community pathways, GP, and the call before convey, which is coming in.
Can you just tell us a little bit more about that for anyone who might not know what that means?
Yeah, so generally what that looks like at the moment is if we go out to somebody in a care home, and we think, well, maybe this person needs to go to hospital, either because we haven't got the capability of doing a complete and thorough diagnostic kind of workup on them, or we're just not really too sure. In the past, we would have took them in. Now we've got the capability to phone up and speak to somebody at the hospital, consultant, to say, this is what I've got, this is the presentation, what do you think? Because sometimes it's not that the patient doesn't need that diagnostic work or doesn't need to go somewhere, it's just not necessarily to A&E, not necessarily now. So it is really, and I know it's almost cliched now, but it is about getting the right care, at the right time for the right person. So and we're much better at doing that, and as we evolve, there's more and more things coming online.
What are the pressures that hit? I know we are hopefully coming out of the winter period now, and we can kind of sit and reflect on what are some of the big pressures that particularly the ambulance service sees in these colder winter months.
Mostly predictable, mostly to do with your flu season, your norovirus season, your RSV season. And we know this year that flu hit earlier, a good couple of weeks earlier. So we saw that initial pressure maybe a little bit earlier than we were anticipating, and with that, comes the subsequent capacity issues, capacity and demands. Hospital handover becomes a bit tricky because hospitals are suddenly starting to get very full. The flow through the hospital is difficult. So that's typically over the course of a winter, that's the main pressures that we see. Then added into that, we all experience our own staff coming down with these things, so we'll have a workforce pressure sometimes, and then add into that anything that happens in terms of weather. So we're effectively a mobile service.
We've not done too bad with snow this year, have we?
Snow's been fine. Often it's things like high winds, typically over the past few years with storms, and flooding for the road network. So these are all challenges, particularly in our rural areas. So again, we do a lot of planning in order to work with local partners who've got access to 4x4 capability, basically mountain rescue and others, who can support us when the weather turns and we have difficulty getting to some areas. So that's typically the pressures that we do see over winter.
Yeah. And what about, you've already mentioned, I guess, how important the partnership working is when we're in the real crux of those pressures. And, I see it myself every day when we're in that. How important is that in terms of the support that all the different parts of the system can give each other? I think we all recognise that it's a collective pressure, isn't it? But when you're in the thick of it, it's sometimes hard, isn't it?
It is hard, and again, reflecting on, I've been in EPRR on and off now for a good 15 years, and how we've developed as a system is I don't think we often appreciate, because it is, at times it could have been confrontational, and everybody being very protective of their own services and their own sites. whereas increasingly now we're much more collaborative. There's much greater appreciation that actually if we all pool our resources together and we do diverts and deflections maybe of the ambulances that are coming in, that'll spread the workload, give sites, hospitals time to recuperate, to recover their position, and then return to kind of normal in terms of those hospital conveyances. So the system that we've got now with the System Coordination Centre and our Operations Coordination Centre and the on-calls from the acute trusts who meet on a regular basis, sometimes multiple times a day, depending on what the situation is, to discuss, to offer assistance to each other, or just to be quite frank and say, actually, there's nothing we can do to support at this current moment in time. But at least everybody's aware of what's going on.
Can we talk a little bit around, you mentioned around how you support staff. It's a big job being a paramedic, especially during these times of pressure when, they might be on a really, 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 really busy shift. And actually, some of the things that paramedics have to deal with and see, it's quite a big emotional toll. So what support have we got in place for our staff on the ground that are out there helping people?
What we try to do is, a lot of forecasting. It's a lot of demand forecasting, both in 111 and call taking and operationally and for our clinicians. So the point of that really being that we have, as best as we can, sufficient staffing, so that people aren't constantly looking at the pressure and constantly, when they get to hospital, looking at the outstanding amount of emergencies and all of that psychological pressure on them, just to kind of keep going. So also, nobody wants to turn up to a house 3 hours after we said we would be there, and the patient's deteriorated, and all of the stress and the distress and the patient harm that's potentially been as a result of that. So the more operational resources that we can get out there on the road, the better our response times, the better the patient experience, and the better experience for our frontline clinicians. So that's one thing. The other thing that we do is, yes, at times we see some really kind of challenging things, and I think we've got much better over the years in terms of supporting our staff's mental health. Mm-hmm. So we have debriefing after jobs, particularly traumatic jobs. We have referral processes for staff to get support, talking therapies and things, and the same is true in our call taking. I think often there is a focus, and quite rightly, on our frontline staff, but actually there is a lot of pressure on our call takers because they're on the end of the phone having to listen to some really difficult things and sometimes quite abusive phone calls, and so we've put stuff in place to support them as well.
That's a really good point, and I know this from watching Ambulance on the telly. I really enjoy that programme. You just touched a little bit on abuse, and that's not something I guess that's unique to NEAS staff, but something we're seeing increasingly across the region. How do you deal with that? I mean, you've probably, as a paramedic yourself, experienced some of that firsthand. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with that?
Again, we try to train our staff in order to deal with conflict and diffuse conflict. We clearly encourage our staff to report any abuse, even if it's just verbal abuse. We have all any calls coming into our service are recorded, so we know we can use that in case we need to kind of pursue prosecutions. We encourage our frontline staff to wear body-worn video cameras, mm-hmm. so we can capture anything. All of our vehicles have got cameras in now, so we can capture any behaviour. And then subsequent support to our staff, and support through any process of physical or mental recovery and any prosecutions that we pursue.
It's such a big challenge, isn't it, across not just the NHS but the whole of public services, people facing unwarranted abuse really when they're just trying to get on with their jobs. We were talking again before we started the podcast around the change in role of, I guess, the ambulance service, and you think of an ambulance coming to an emergency, but actually the breadth of things that you guys respond to and help people with in their lives is just vast. Could you give some reflections on that?
Certainly when I joined the service, and a lot of the training that we got was all about major life-threatening injuries and illnesses, and how we would respond to that, stabilise a patient and get them to hospital. Increasingly, and in reality, a lot of what we do is more urgent work. So when we go out, it's more making every contact count, advice and guidance, referrals into more primary care routes, and there is a proportion which will be a life-threatening emergencies, but it's not as large a proportion as people may think. So I think a lot of the training now reflects that in terms of the paramedic training, the paramedics that come through. But yeah, we deal from everything from delivering babies to resuscitating somebody to I've gone out in the past for toothaches, headaches, to the whole range, and that's frontline responding. On the phones again, our clinical assessment service and our 111 call handlers deal with a whole range of inquiries across the breadth of whatever you can imagine.
And how much of that is people with mental health problems? How much of that is your workload now? We do see that across the whole of health and social care, and the impact of people's mental health, whether they're in a crisis situation, or how much of that is part of the stuff that you see in your day-to-day?
I think it's regular, and if it's not kind of I'm going to call it a primary mental health call out, often mental health can lead to lifestyle choices that can then lead to incidents or accidents or chronic medical conditions, or so that it's quite a complex picture really when you're talking about mental health. But I think the work again with the mental health providers that we've got, with the crisis teams, the 111 option 2 that's come in, I think that's all helped to support our crews when we're going out to scene, and also when we're making those initial calls to get the patient speaking to the right person at the front door, and then with right care, right person, obviously we've seen that introduced over the past 2 years. Where
can you remind us about that?
So right care, right person is really in response to police primarily maybe going out and going to mental health patients or other patients and transporting them to hospital, or because essentially traditionally they were waiting around on scene for ambulances to turn up, or other providers. So there was a big push to say, well, police have a certain sphere of responsibility, and anything outside of that sphere of responsibility, when it comes to patients, when it comes to mental health, the ambulance service, mental health providers should really be kind of intervening at that right stage, So we've gone through a process across the region now where, when we think of your mental health, your section 136s, mental health transports. So if somebody's sectioned on the Mental Health Act, rather than the police have always been the transportation, which is not good for the patient to be bundled in the back of a police car,
especially if they're suffering from mental health problems.
Yeah. So we've done a lot of work regionally with our mental health colleagues, with the ICB and with the police to make sure that we get the right resource again to those kinds of patients. But yes,
it's fascinating, the breadth of stuff that you guys deliver. It's just brilliant. I think we're probably nearing the end of my list of questions. I guess I did just want to ask you about what does the future hold? I guess what are the biggest things that are on your horizon at the minute in your role, in your emergency preparedness world, and I guess the future of the ambulance service, and when we think about the NHS long term and that importance of being in the community. Do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, well, we all know the push from the 10-year plan in terms of, from hospital to community. I think that's got challenges for the role I'm in terms of emergency preparedness, because if we've got an incident that takes place in a community, what else do we have to factor in now? are there community providers that are affected? Are there more vulnerable patients and different types of vulnerability out in the community now that we have to factor into our plans for emergency response? So I think that's the big push. The digital, the analog to digital, I think is really challenging in terms of cybersecurity. So we're doing a lot of thought and planning around some of that. I think incrementally we're seeing a lot more capability in terms of diagnostic capability in the community, and I think that's probably a future direction for us. We've got now, specialist paramedics for urgent care. We've got specialist paramedics for critical care, so who can deliver additional diagnostics, additional treatment options. Again, with the view to sometimes keeping patients at home or certainly getting them to the right place of care to prevent secondary transfers and things. So I think it's an exciting time in terms of pre-hospital care, because the landscape's changing so rapidly, and therefore that's a challenging time for EPRR, because we've got to make sure that we can keep the wheels turning all of the time.
No pun intended.
Yeah.
Literally keep the wheels turning.
Yeah.
Stu, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. I guess I just wanted to end by saying a huge thank you to all colleagues at NEAS as we come through probably one of the busiest times of year for the ambulance service. So whether that is the people answering the phone, the paramedics on the front line, and everybody else in between that makes everything run like clockwork, thank you. On behalf of the NHS, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.